Hey guys, Joe here from Wild Aquatics and Exotics. This is the third video in our Introduction to Marine Aquarium series, where we take you step by step through the basic theory of setting up and maintaining your first saltwater tank. In today's video, we're going to go through the basics of water chemistry in marine tanks. So why are water parameters in marine tanks so important? In a marine aquarium, fish, corals and invertebrates rely on stable water conditions. Unlike freshwater tanks where fish can tolerate a large range of conditions, saltwater animals are far less forgiving. Even small fluctuations in temperature or changes in salinity from evaporation can lead to stress, disease, or even death. That's why understanding and maintaining water parameters is the key to success in saltwater aquariums. Because stability is more important than anything, you will need to actively test your aquarium's water weekly. Try to minimize the swings that can happen, and replenish elements like calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium when required. Furthermore, you'll have to constantly top up for evaporation to make sure the salinity stays stable, which can fortunately be automated with an auto top-off unit. To make water chemistry easier to understand, we'll break down each water parameter individually. Firstly, salinity, or specific gravity. Salinity is the most important parameter to keep consistent in a reef tank, and it is only really going to change in accordance to evaporation. For example, if you were to have a pint of water and add any amount of salt to it, if you were to leave it to evaporate by 50%, then the concentration of salt in the half pint of water would be double as strong as it was previously. This is super important to remember because as the salinity gets more concentrated as the water evaporates, so does all the other dissolved elements like calcium, alkalinity and magnesium. Therefore, you need to consistently top up for evaporation with pure RO to keep the salinity and other dissolved elements stable. When initially adding salt to RO to make your saltwater, it's not measured by weight, but is instead measured in specific gravity using a refractometer. To use a refractometer, place a drop of the salt water onto the lens and look through the device into a light. You'll see a marker where you can see the measurement. RO is reverse osmosis water, which is water that goes through a purification process to remove all dissolved solids. i.e., UK tap water can have anything between 100 to 500 total dissolved solids, or TDS, but RO water has ideally 0. To improve the efficiency of an RO unit, you can add a deionizing resin, which should consistently lead to a 0 TDS RO every time, which is referred to as RODI. RO water is the base water that you'll be adding your salt mix to. The ideal salinity for reef tanks is 1.025 to 1.026 specific gravity. This range will cause dissolved calcium, alkalinity and magnesium to stay in the correct range upon mixing. For fish-only tanks, however, you can actually keep the salinity a little lower, between 1.020 to 1.025. This is because the fish themselves are less sensitive to change than corals, and saltwater parasites are less likely to establish in less saline water. One thing to bear in mind, however, is that if you intend to keep a fish-only system with a lower salinity, you do need to make sure that your other water parameters like alkalinity are raised to the correct range so that you can keep your pH stable, in which case you should supplement your alkalinity separately. Secondly, temperature is very simple to maintain with the purchase of a good quality heater with a built-in thermostat. Similar to a freshwater tank, just set it in the correct range and make sure to regularly check it in case of equipment malfunction. The ideal range for all marine aquariums is around 24 to 26 degrees centigrade. Next, ammonia nitrite, which exactly like in freshwater tanks, are toxic to animals and even in small amounts can cause gill damage, stress and even death. To ensure that you don't have ammonia or nitrite in your aquarium, make sure that your tank is fully cycled before adding livestock. Remember, don't rely on your live rock being fully cycled upon purchase. There will always be some sort of bacterial die-off during transportation, so make sure to leave the tank fully running with the skimmer turned on for a couple of days to make sure your live rock is fully cured, and then test the water to make sure it's safe before adding livestock. With nitrate, again the exact same principles apply as in a freshwater aquarium. Marine fish are relatively tolerant to nitrate compared to corals and can handle nitrates up to around 30 to 40 parts per million, although you should aim for as clean as possible. Reef tanks, however, will require much cleaner water, 5 parts per million or less, with some soft corals tolerating up to around 10. Higher than 5 to 10 nitrates will begin to cause stress and even kill sensitive corals, and at the very least will begin to cause nuisance algae growth. To lower your nitrates, simply perform regular water changes and potentially consider growing macroalgae in the display or in a refugium, which will naturally consume excess nitrate. Most importantly, a protein skimmer will remove the dissolved organics and waste entirely from the water before they contribute to nitrate rises. Another option for nitrate reduction is carbon dosing, which is when you add a small dose of a chemical which will feed the nitrate reducing bacteria, but this is a bit more advanced and will be covered in a later video. Phosphate is something you'll also need to consider, and is relatively similar to nitrate in the way that it is created by waste in the tank. Excessive phosphate, however, is usually much more responsible for nuisance algae growth than high nitrates. The ideal range for fish-only tanks is less than 0.1 parts per million, but for reef tanks it should be less than 0.03 parts per million. Like nitrate, you can reduce phosphates by water changing regularly. Unlike nitrate, however, there are phosphate-removing medias like Rowaphos which will absorb the phosphate in the water. This is most effective when used in a media reactor. It's worth bearing in mind, however, that in a fish-only system, you can really starve a chance for algae to grow if you keep your phosphates as low as possible. However, in a reef tank, you will actually need some phosphates to allow corals to grow properly, so aiming for absolute zero in a reef tank should be avoided. Calcium is one of the main building blocks for coral skeletons, which are made up of calcium carbonate. The ideal range for reef tanks is between 380 to 450 parts per million. This is not a major concern for fish-only tanks, but it is important for corals as they need calcium to build their skeletons. Low calcium leads to slow coral growth and even die off if the levels drop too low. Simply test weekly and dose calcium supplements when needed. There are also other options to maintain this, including dosing Kalkwasser or by using a calcium reactor, but these are topics for separate videos as they are more complicated than simply dosing a calcium supplement individually. Alkalinity is another important element for coral skeletons, and it is very similar to water hardness in freshwater tanks in the way that it will affect your pH of the water, so this should be your main priority alongside salinity to keep as stable as possible. The ideal range is between 8 to 12 DKH. To maintain a stable alkalinity, you can dose supplements weekly or preferably daily to make sure it is as stable as possible, or, like calcium, use a calcium reactor or consider dosing Kalkwasser. Magnesium is also used in forming of coral skeletons. With magnesium, however, it was responsible for linking calcium and alkalinity together at the correct ratio. So you need to keep this stable so that the calcium and alkalinity do not precipitate and individually swing out of the correct ranges. In practical terms, if you were to test your calcium and alkalinity and are surprised by the result, it could be because the magnesium is incorrect. Therefore, you should make sure your magnesium is in the correct range first before making adjustments to calcium or alkalinity. The ideal range for magnesium in reef tanks is 1200 to 1400 parts per million and is not really a major concern for fish-only tanks. There are also trace elements like potassium, strontium, iron and iodine, etc. Reef tanks need these in small amounts, and unless you're getting super advanced, you do not need to dose these individually. Regular water changes should be enough to maintain the balance and the correct ratios. pH, again like in freshwater, is denoted by the hardness of the water, in this case alkalinity, and the gas content of the water. With a decent sized protein skimmer, which does a very good job at oxygenating the water, any incorrect pH value is usually due to a drop in alkalinity, which is usually caused by the corals growing. An ideal pH is around 7.8 to 8.4, and this is important because low pH will cause coral stress and poor fish health. To maintain this at the correct range, maintain proper alkalinity dosing and ensure good oxygenation. For oxygen and CO2 levels, you should not need to be worried too much if you have the correct equipment in place. Wave makers and skimmers will help to improve gas exchange. And again, poor gas exchange will lead to low pH and therefore stress out the fish and corals. To summarise, with fish-only tanks you can get away with having slightly higher nitrates and phosphates, as the only issues you'll have are with nuisance algae. However, investing in good quality equipment like a protein skimmer will help you to keep the nitrates and phosphates low. In a fish-only aquarium as well, you do not have to worry about the technical water parameters like you would do in a reef tank. However, you will need to keep your salinity and alkalinity as stable as possible. For reef tanks, you have a much smaller margin of error and some precise ranges to aim for. You may be able to get away with a few corals initially, as the replenishment of these elements can be provided by simple water changes alone. However, in advanced marine tanks highly stocked with corals, because they are growing and using up all the available elements, these need to be replenished regularly, in which case should be added in the form of supplements. This is required to keep the parameters stable and can be dosed either manually or automatically with dosing pumps. In terms of priority, your salinity, alkalinity and temperature should be treated as the most important to keep as stable as possible. On that note, it's very important to always make sure to test the water weekly before adding any supplements and never do any guesswork. One of the most important bits of advice as well is that swings are much more damaging to corals than incorrect ranges. i.e., if your calcium, alkalinity, or magnesium were at incorrect ranges but they were stable, it's less damaging to corals and vertebrates than if these parameters were constantly dropping and raising. This is a definite reason to get into automated, or at the very least, manual dosing of individual supplements rather than just relying on water changes. Congratulations, you now know the basics of saltwater chemistry. Whilst there is a lot more detail that we can go onto on this subject, the greater detail will come in later videos throughout the series. In the next video, we're going to go into a bit more detail about live rock and filtration in marine tanks. Thanks for watching, and if you found this video helpful, make sure to like and subscribe for more aquarium guides.